Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shmini, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 8. It's another day on graves. Today we're specifically going to be focused on lost graves. Both what happens if you know there used to be a grave in a certain place and then you lost track of it, how do you treat the general place? And if you find a grave, randomly, there was clearly a grave lost for a long time and then all of a sudden you stumble upon a grave, what do you do with that? And the laws dealing with the protective measures that were taken just for such cases where the court was supposed to go around every once in a while and mark areas where there was known to be graves, so people shouldn't lose track of them. That's called tziyun kvares, marking the graves, and we'll see the laws related to that as well. Halacha Aleph says the Rambam, Sadeh she'avad kever b'seicha. You have a field, you know there used to be a grave here. Somewhere over here there's a dead person buried, and you lost track of it. You don't know where it is now. Afara mitame b'maga uvemasa. All of its dirt transmits impurity by touching it and by carrying it, kebeis hapras, just like a beis hapras. Now, a beis hapras we talked about earlier in these chapters. It's a rabbinic imposition that if there was a grave in a field, you knew where the grave was, and then you plowed over it. Now it's very possible that the bones of the skeleton are spread around, all around the field, and therefore the entire field needs to be treated rabbinically as imparting impurity of a corpse. So, by the way, we're going to get a whole chapter on that in 2 days from now. But the Rambam says over here, when you have a sadeh she'avad kever b'seicha, where you lost track of the grave, you have to treat it like a beis hapras. And all of the earth is going to impart impurity by touching it and carrying it. Shema nadesh hakever ba, for the same reason of the beis hapras. What's the beis hapras's reason why the entire earth is considered impure? Because maybe there's bones all around. Here too, maybe it was stepped on, the grave, and v'yiyu atzames kisa'ira b'seich afara. Anywhere there could be a barley corn size of bone, which imparts impurity of a corpse. And the entirety of the field, if somebody forms a tent over it, he also becomes impure. If you put a tent up somewhere in the middle of the field, everything out of doubt in that tent becomes impure. Just maybe the tent that you put up, maybe it's making a tent over the exact spot of the grave. In this field where you lost track of the grave, you built a home on the field. 2 stories. 1 story on the bottom, 2nd story on the top, as they always did in those days. The 2nd story was not accessed from within the home, it was accessed from outside the home with the staircase. This picture comes from the Art Scroll Mishnayos, the Mishnah elucidated, the newer set which they just printed recently. And you have a double-story home. So the Rambam says, Im haya pischa shel aliyah, keneged pischa shel bayis, if it's this scenario, where the opening to the upper story is directly above the opening to the lower story, ha'aliyah tahira, then the upper story is completely pure. Sha'afilu haya hakever tachas mashkef habayis ha'aliyah tahira. Because even if you knew where the grave was, and you knew that the grave was directly under the lintel of the lower story, the upper story would still be pure. Sha'arihu oyel al gabi oyel kameshi yizbar, because as we're going to explain later in the chapters dealing at length with oyel, a tent on top of a tent, the 2nd story tent does not become impure. V'im lo haya mechuvan. But if the doors were not aligned, then afa aliyah tmeya. Then I have to, out of doubt, make the upper story impure as well. Shema askupas aliyah ala kever. Maybe the threshold of the upper story is directly above where the grave is, which makes the upper story form a tent over the grave and makes it become impure. Halacha Gimel, v'sadezu, this field where you lost track of a grave, muter lizreya b'seicha kol zera, you can plant in it any types of plants, grain and such. Because the roots of the plants are not going to reach all the way to the grave. They're pretty shallow, the roots. And therefore, even if you pull them out, you're not going to pull out anything from the grave. But you cannot plant in it trees, fruit trees, because the roots of those do reach to the dead body, and that contact makes them impure. Now, what does it mean the trees or the fruits are going to become impure? Nothing becomes impure while it's still attached to the ground, as we're going to learn later. And the answer appears to be the understanding of the Kesef Mishnah, that this is not having to do with impurity per se. This has to do with benefiting from a corpse. You're not allowed to have any hana, any benefit from an area of a graveyard. And if you're going to be growing trees from the place and they're going to be reaching the corpse, then the fruits are going to, by extension, be a benefit of the cemetery, which is forbidden. That's one explanation. The Ravid says, nothing to do with the impurity of the trees, says people will typically build homes near fruit trees. And they're going to end up becoming impure because they're next to the trees. Hatluliyos hakrevos le'ir hasmucha lebeis hakvaris. Tluliyos are little mounds of earth. Little mounds of earth that are close to a city which is next to a cemetery. This is the small little city. They had their own local cemetery. And as we're going to see, when people thought they had access to a cemetery, which means access to an impure place, they didn't mind increasing the level of impurity around that place. Whereas if there was no cemetery in the area, people would be extra careful not to bring impurity to a regularly or by default pure place. But here we have an ir hasmucha lebeis hakvaris, it's a city near a cemetery. And now there's these little mounds that are close to that city, or they're close to the path that leads to the cemetery. Echad chadashes ve'echad yishanes, whether these mounds are new or old. Hare'elu becheskas tuma. The mounds of earth can be presumed to be impure mipnei shehanashim kovres sham as hanefalim, because women who miscarried and didn't want to make a big deal out of it, they would bury their fetuses in here. Humuke shchin kovrin sham evereim. People that had a disintegrating or degenerative disease where the boils on their skin would cause their limbs to fall off, they would bury their limbs over there. And therefore they impart impurity. But the ones that are far from the city, newer ones are pure. No reason to think people brought impurity into them. But the older ones are still impure. Because maybe they used to be close to a city that was later destroyed or a path that we lost track of. What's called a close mound? One that has nothing closer than it. In this case, this mound down over here, that's the closest to the grave. The yashan, what's called an old mound, she'ein adam zeichrei. Nobody remembers when it was made. It was made before the oldest person remembers when they made it. Halacha dalid, sdei boichim, the field of crying. So it's customary in Talmudic times, they had a little field adjacent to a cemetery where the mourners would come either before or after the funeral and literally cry there, eulogize the dead and do whatever they had to do. It's the place that's near the cemetery, where the woman would sit there and cry. Even though its dirt is pure, because there's no reason to presume impurity. We don't allow people to plant trees or plant plants there. Not to get people accustomed to going there, because maybe there is impurity, and we want to avoid that at all costs. It's close to a cemetery. Any owner of the property would have already despaired from it, so people would do whatever they want, and maybe there is impurity there. It's very possible that a person might come there and bury there. Therefore, they worried about it, and they said, you know what, ideally don't plant stuff there. However, it's not considered impure to any basic level, so much so that they would take dirt without hesitation from this area and make ovens with it to be used for sacrificial meat. Because there's no presumed impurity. No presumed impurity, we're not going to say that there's impurity for any reason if we don't have to. Halacha hey, kever hanimtza. If you discover a grave, you're digging, you stumble upon a grave. Mutar lefanoisai. So right away, the basic law is that you're allowed to move it. Move the grave, move the bones, whatever is left of it. Be'im pinahu, but if you did move it, you can't just think that you're done with it. Mekoymai tameh, the place under it remains impure. The asr bahana, it's also forbidden to have benefit from it, ad sheyibadek k'moshe yizbar, until it's checked, as we're going to explain tomorrow. Whenever you find a grave, you always have to suspect maybe there's a whole cemetery here. And therefore you have to check it first. There's a special way to check it. Until you check it, you have to consider it a cemetery, and it's forbidden to have benefit. Now, the Rambam tomorrow is going to explain that actually this law is only true if you find 3 graves together. If you just find a single grave, you don't have to worry that there's a cemetery. No need for an investigation. Therefore, the Kesef Mishnah explains over here when the Rambam says kever hanimtza, he actually means 3 graves. If you discovered 3 graves, the point is that you can move it away, but if you did, you keep it impure until you check and decide if it's actually a cemetery. The kever hayadua, on the other hand, if you have a grave which you know about, asr lefanoisai, you cannot just move around graves. V'im pinohu, if you did, mekoymai tahar, the place under it is pure, umutar bahana, and it's permitted to derive benefit from it. Simply this means it's permitted to derive benefit from the place. The place of the grave is not considered to be a cemetery because you know there's only one individual grave there. Some people say it's actually also referring to the building of the grave itself. The structure of the grave itself is also permitted to have benefit from it once you move it. Halacha vav, kever shehu mazik asar rabbi. When you have a grave that's known, but it's damaging the public, not just physically, people are walking by it and becoming impure. ritually impure because of it. Mefanei said we do move it away, but we keep the place impure and forbidden to have benefit from it because it was just simply moved to avoid public damage, but the place itself should still be treated as somewhat of a cemetery. Halacha zayin hapegea b'meis mitzvah. Somebody encounters a meis mitzvah, that means a dead body, just somewhere on the road, you have no idea who it is. If you find it within the 2,000 amma perimeter of a city, you should bring it to the local cemetery. If you found it outside the perimeter of the extent of the city, even if it's in the middle of a field of saffron, which is very expensive, high quality stuff, the halacha is that a meis mitzvah acquires his place. He should be buried right there. If you find him on a border, move him to the side, off the border. If you have a choice to bury him in an unplowed field on this side and a plowed field on that side, do the less damage, bury him in the unplowed field. If you have a plowed field and a planted field, bury him in the plowed field, the less developed one. A planted field and a vineyard, bury him in the planted field. An orchard and a vineyard, bury him in the vineyard, so as to avoid the tent of Tumas. Once you have trees, there's lots of laws that come into, the overhangs of trees can transmit Tumas through the tent. We want to avoid that, so just stay in the vineyard. Hayushnei and Shavim, if they were both equal, it's at your prerogative, you bury him whatever side you want. Halacha ches, kever hanimtza, when a grave is discovered, mitame lemafreya. We have to assume that it was there from before, and therefore it imparts impurity retroactively. If you know you passed over the area, you become impure. That's the last presumed status of the place. Some of the commentaries ask, what do you mean? The last presumed status of the place, at some point it was pure. This dead body wasn't here forever. So actually, in a way, the last thing we know is that it was pure, not impure. But nevertheless, that chazaka of the original cheskas tara, that presumption is not powerful enough. Right now we have a dead body in front of us. We have to assume back to when it's last potentially known, you have to be considered to be impure. But if somebody comes and says, I'm certain there was no grave here, even 20 years before, then it's only going to transmit impurity from the time you find it and onwards. Halacha test, now we move to the halacha of markings. Anybody that discovers a grave or a dead body or an element of a corpse which could transmit impurity through a tent, he must mark it, so it shouldn't be a stumbling block for others. On the intermediate days of holidays, they used to send agents from the court to mark the graves. If all you have is exactly an olive-sized portion of a dead body, we don't mark that. Because in the end, it's going to disintegrate in the ground. What do we use to mark? Besid, with plaster, with lime. You melt it down, you pour it out on the place of the impurity, and that's how you would mark it. Now, actually, on the place is not so accurate. We don't put the mark directly on the place where the impurity is. It should stick out a little bit this side and that side, on the sides, not to cause additional pure entities to become lost. If you're only going to mark the exact place, people won't realize till they step on it. When it's extended, you're going to be more careful. But we don't want to make it too far out, the marking, not to destroy Israel, right? The more markings you have, people are going to stay away from that. Now you're destroying this place from being developed. We don't want to destroy too much. No need to mark things that are definitely known with certainty. And you're doing lakal because everybody knows about them. Is only on doubts. Like you have a field where you lost a grave. Schachos are overhangs from a tree where you don't know if potentially there could be something tamei there and then it's a tent. Prois is extensions from a wall. Same thing, there might be impurity under here, just in case this might be a tent, so we mark those. Halacha Yud, Matzah Sada Mitzuyenes, Ve'en Yadua Mativa. You found a field with markings, you don't know what it is about this field that requires markings. So there's a quick way to check. In Ein Ba'ilanis, if there are no fruit trees, Biyadua Sha'avad Bakever, then you can be certain that it was a field where a grave was lost. That was the beginning of the chapter. You have such a field, you cannot plant trees in there. So if there's no trees, that's the kind of field it is. Yesh ba'ilanes, if there are trees, biyadu asher nechrash bakever. The issue with the field might be that a grave was plowed in. It's a beis hapras, kameshi yizbar, as will be explained in in 2 days in chapter 10. Halacha Yud Aleph, Matzah Even Mitzuyanes, if you find a stone with a marking, Tachteha Tameh, under it is impure. It's a sign of a cover for a grave or something. Hayu Shtayim, if there were 2 stones with markings. Im Yesh Sid Beinehen, if the marking was between them, not as in this picture, between them, Beinehem Tameh, the area between them is impure. The stones are there just to protect. They're kind of enclosing a Tameh space. V'im Ein Sid Beinehem, if there is no lime or plaster between them, Ela al Rasheyan, only on their heads, then we check again the area in between. Im Yesh Cheres Beinehem, if there are some pottery shards between them, Tahar, it's pure. She'ein Ze Ela Binyan, this is just leftover of a construction site. So there's pottery shards and lime, nothing to do with grapes. If there is no pottery, and the plaster was kind of flattened down on the edges of the stone on each side, that is a marking, and that is impure. Matzah metzer echad mitzuya, and you come to a field and you find one border marked. Hu tameh v'chol asad tahira. Just the border is impure, everything else is pure. It's not a marking that's enclosing the field. V'chein shniya, v'chein shlishya, same thing if you find the second or even a third border marked, it doesn't disqualify the field. Matzah arba mitzareh mitzuyan, and if you find all 4 borders marked, so actually hein tahirin, the borders become pure. The chol asad kula tmeya, and the entirety of the field is impure. The reason he marked the 4 borders is not because somewhere in this field there's an impure place. The entire field is impure. As we explained, you don't make the marking too far away. So the reason the borders were marked is because that's the closest they could make it. They made a slight extension, which is why the borders themselves are pure, but after that, the entirety of the field is impure.